There goes. Okay, everyone. Welcome to the 9th lecture for human motor control and learning. I hope that the material from the second half of the course has been fairly straightforward for you as we're taking principles from the motor control aspect of the course and applying it to maximizing learning. Today, specifically, what we're going to do is talk about practice conditions. And so we're going to be learning about different ways or different sort of like variables or factors to consider in adjusting your practice to maximize the learning for each session. What we're going to do is start off with a concept of practice variability. We're going to be talking about organizing variable practice in the context of practice. And then we're going to be talking about this idea of contextual interference and how it helps to improve or maximize learning. We're going to briefly discuss practice specificity and then finish off with talking about the amount of practice and how to distribute that practice to maximize learning. And then we'll talk about how long to wait in between trials when practicing. Okay, let's get started. So here we have 3 pictures. So we have a soccer team or football team, we have a hockey team, and then we have a Lokomat machine. So this is like spinal cord rehab, so relearning how to walk. And depending on the motor skill that you're learning or you're trying to teach to learners, you want to consider what are the most effective strategies to run that practice. Are there any coaches or therapists in the class? Who's training or coaching? Ooh, that's a good one. Samantha says, make it fun. And, yep, okay, and why? So give me some reasons as to why, you're right, why making it fun would be beneficial for learning. Yep, engagement. Because we know cognitively, it's the cognitive aspect or keeping attention on what you're doing that's going to allow for more learning, right? Yep, progressive is a good factor or a good answer. And so give me a sport. We'll make up a hypothetical practice strategy. Baseball, okay. So baseball or boxing, whoever wants to answer first. How would you, first, and this is a super general question, how would you organize your practice for boxing or baseball? I guess the first thing is what of those motor skills or of those sports do you want to get across in the practice? I guess would be the thing. So what in baseball or what in boxing are you going to want to teach the learners for that class? Punching, leg movement. Okay. Caitlin, for baseball, or do you guys just want to go with boxing? Okay, boxing. Okay. So you've decided that this is the aspect of the skill that you want to train and practice. And so what you want to do is you want to come up with different practice strategies for that aspect. So if you wanted to do punching and leg movement, how would you have them just do the same thing for an hour-long practice, or would you break it up, or what's your thoughts on what you would do? No wrong answers. Different variation. Yeah, there you go. So Ahmed, interestingly, is saying doing variations of the same skill, which is exactly what research tells us leads to improved learning. And this yeah, there you go. Ahmed. Is that Ahmed Ali or is that Muhammad Ali? Because he's a boxer. Okay, so this brings us into the concept of practice variability, or varying practice allows for maximizing learning. We're going to get into it, but why do you think that variability within practice leads to better learning? And so what do you mean by that? Imitates real conditions. You're not wrong. You're right. But the way to consider, like, is this imitating real life? Is that because in, like, specifically for open skills, the environment's always changing, right? So by having movement variability in practice, it prepares you for the potential variations that you're going to see in real life. Yep, exactly. There's the exact same thing. Stagnant and challenging. Yeah, that's also true too. Yep. That's also a very good point, JP, that if it's stagnant or if you're practicing the same thing, you stop focusing and then you're not going to learn, right? So given that variability is important, what aspects of the skill then, if you're going whatever you're teaching, what would you vary? How much variation do you want to introduce? And then how do you want to organize this variation? This is sort of the concepts that we're going to be going through. So remember, variability of practice experiences during practice is important for motor skill learning. And so the term in research, practice variability, refers to the variation of the movement and context characteristics that the learner will experience as they're practicing. So movement practice variability will be the different variations of the skill that they're learning in practice. And so what sort of things then can you alter? Right now, it is easier to consider sports that we're familiar with, but what about like rehab environments, or what about when you're training like very specific like work type motor skills, right? What kind of things generally can you vary in practice? Okay. You can, and so the answers are two things. You could, oh, you're answering my question. I took a break just to take a sip of coffee. Well, the things that you can vary in practice are either going to be the physical context of the environment or the variation of the movement. Does that make sense? So you can change things in the environment, or you can vary the movement required. And so we'll learn about maybe some of the factors to consider when introducing variability in practice. But the reason why research is showing that increased practice variability leads to positive transfer into real life situations is because of all of the things that you all said. That, if you take it one step a little bit backwards, by having variations of the skill while you're learning, you're introducing more performance error, right? And cognitively, remember in the cognitive stage of learning, what the learner is trying to do is figure out what to do and problem solve, right? And so by introducing variations, you're introducing more errors that the learner will learn to deal with, right? So that's going to lead to a better ability to deal with variations in real life when they're performing the skill in a test situation or a real life situation or in a game. Does that make sense, everyone? Oh yeah, good. Jillian Slade, thank you for joining us. So they generally say evaluating the errors allows for the learner's improved problem solving ability. And so this was this study here that sort of analyzed whether or not this was a factor or true. And what this study was looking at was teaching non-skilled individuals how to shoot a basketball free throw. So they took people that had no experience and were going to teach them how to shoot a free throw. So it's actually a closed skill. So what they did was they had one group that would just practice from the free throw line. And then they had different groups that would practice different variations of the shot. So in front and behind the free throw line, in front, behind, and at the elbows, and then at the free throw line and at the elbows. I think was, you can look up the study, but it was different variations. And what the study found was that the group that had practiced shots from varying locations actually learned the best on the retention test, or performed the best on the retention test. So it proved or supported this concept of practice variability. It led to them better being able to complete that motor skill. Does that make sense? Now that was a closed skill. So these rules are just sort of general because that study showed that you took a closed skill and did variations of where, like by changing the regulatory conditions, and it led to better learning. Generally, you want to consider the type of skill, whether it's open or closed, and whether or not there's intertrial variability, to figure out what would be the best things to adjust to maximize learning for that motor skill, right? So you want to assess the characteristics of the skill in the physical context where it is. Remember, like the two things that you can alter to introduce variability are the movements or the environment. So you want to look at those factors or those variables, and then consider what kind of skill you're wanting to teach to figure out what you should alter to introduce variability. So generally speaking, for closed skills, you want to alter non-regulatory conditions. Now, the reason why they made up this rule, so remember in the previous study, they were non-skilled non-skilled learners trying to learn how to do a basketball shot. So introducing practice variability gave them the ability to figure out how to shoot. Because it's a closed skill, then what you would want to do is then have them really practice. If it's just free throws you want them to do, right? Then you would consider changing the non-regulatory conditions for that motor skill, because it is a closed skill without intertrial variability. So this would be more for skills once you sort of develop the pattern. The variability is to develop the pattern. But because nothing changes with every repetition of the free throw, you would want to start varying non-regulatory conditions when introducing variability. For closed skills with intertrial variability, like the golf shot, you would want to change or alter regulatory and non-regulatory conditions. And then for open skills, you definitely want to change regulatory and non-regulatory conditions. So let's give examples of what those mean. So think about a closed skill with no intertrial variability, like dart throwing. So for dart throwing, there's no sense in changing the distance from the board or the weight of the darts or the board height, because everything is always consistent. So what you want to do for closed skills is you want to start varying non-regulatory conditions. So number of throws taken, the score of the game, so where they're aiming for, lighting, the presence of spectators, like to introduce like practice with being stressed out or working within an audience. That's what you want to sort of start varying to maximize learning or introduce variability. A fairway shot in golf was the second example of a closed skill, but with intertrial variability. Here, you would change non-regulatory and regulatory conditions. And the same is true of open skills, which is like the boxing or any of the skills that we talked about earlier. Does that make sense, everyone? And so in the previous slide, remember with the study, yes, free throws are a closed skill. So technically you just would want to alter non-regulatory conditions. But that study was just trying to get them to learn how to shoot a basketball. Right. So, but if the skill was actually being really good free throw shooter, it's this. So if for free throw shooters, they practice, like people are practicing the free throws, they practice from the free throw line, right? Get 10 in a row or stressful situations, or, you know, they change non-regulatory conditions. Okay, so now we consider our understanding that variability is important to maximize learning, right? Remember, practice performance doesn't dictate how much you've learned, right? It's the test performance. And so by organizing and having variability in practice, you're improving learning. But how do you want to organize that variation in practice then? And that's what we're going to talk about. So is there a best way to organize the practice or the variations? And I forget who said it, but we brought this up about talking about, I think it was JP, right? You don't want to keep doing repetitions of the same thing because it is not allowing them to keep engaged, right? And so this phenomenon is called the contextual interference effect. Contextual interference describes the memory disruption that happens when you are switching from variations of skill. So if you're doing the same variation of a skill, like you're doing the same thing in practice, your brain isn't cognitively trying very hard because it's already put together, you know, an understanding of the variation you're doing. And if you don't switch it, we're not challenging our brain. But by having the variations consistently, we're not giving ourselves a chance to get to that point. Does that make sense? So for learning, you want to have high contextual interference. You want to keep things fresh because you're not allowing the learner to decrease cognitive effort. By varying stuff, you're having them always problem solving. Does that make sense, everyone? Does it make sense? Boom. Thanks, Matt. So just like everything, there's a spectrum from high to low contextual interference. And so depending on the amount of variation and the randomness of how you've introduced the variations in practice, can you please go over contextual interference? Okay, so contextual interference, like I said, is this idea that by having variations of the movement skill, you're challenging the brain to problem solve, right? If you are switching to a new variation, then you are causing memory disruption. Does that make sense? Ahmed? Okay. So so frequently changing the way they are learning the same skill can help them constantly learning at peak forms. Yeah, that's true. It would be more considering that you're not changing the way that they are learning. You're changing them. You're changing the aspect of the skill that they're practicing. So what boxing? So you could do leg work, okay, then do punches, then do blocking, right? You're always changing it a little bit because if you just did a whole hour on punching, they're gonna get bored and they're gonna get used to whatever skill you have. Think about practice, right? Think about any time that you've had a practice structured, you have them doing a similar aspect where like they're doing passes or they're think of a sport, baseball, right? They're practicing sliding or hitting or something. If you keep them doing over and over the same thing, they get good at that they really quickly get good at whatever skill you have them practicing. And if you don't change it, they're going to get bored. Yeah. So to keep them at peak learning, you want to keep varying it so that they're still engaged. They're always constantly engaged. And so depending on how you structure the ways and how frequently you change the practice variations, you're either having high or low on the spectrum of contextual interference. Low contextual interference would be if you're practicing the same thing for the whole hour or for the whole time. High levels would be if you're doing a multitude of different variations in random order, for example. So here was an example of the difference between blocked or random practice and serial practice in a hypothetical baseball practice. So in this hypothetical baseball practice, the learners are being shown or taught 3 variations of throwing a ball: sidearm, overhead, and what's that? Underhand throws. Okay, and so we have different ways to sort of break down the practice. Each of the 3 groups gets 6 days for 30 minutes. Okay. In block practice, see how for the first 2 days for all of the 30 minutes, doing all overhand. For the next 2 days, they're doing all underhand. And then the last 2 days, they're doing all sidearm. So would this represent low or high contextual interference? Right, because there's no variation, right? Like boom, 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 it's all very blocked. That's why it's called block practice. So then random practice, see how every practice is broken down into 6 5-minute intervals? And then they are randomly, for each of the 5 minutes, they're randomly practicing one of the 3 throws. So they're so let's practice underhand for 5 minutes. Okay, now let's do overhand. Now let's do underhand again. Now sidearm. It's random. And so they're continually changing the variation, and it leads to better learning because this would be high contextual interference. And then serial practice would be somewhere in between. Does that make sense, everyone? So remember, like this is like we know that high variability or high contextual interference or random practice leads to the best learning. But remember, with beginners or certain situations, you may have to progress to that, right? And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit briefly. For very difficult tasks, or when the learners are really just beginning, it may be better to start with low contextual interference, so that way they get a better idea of what they're doing and then build up. Oh, and ultimate frisbee. Okay, so Samantha's talking about ultimate frisbee. Centuries, 10 throws, the same throw until you have done. Yeah. That might be random actually. So then the order of which 10 different throws, wait, 10 throws, the same throw. How many different throws are there, or types of throws? And then so is the order that you're doing it the same every practice? Because it looks similar to this. It's time, not like in your practice for ultimate frisbee, it is number of throws, basic 2 and then hit. Okay, so that would be, so the first 2 would be more serial practice, and then the next would be random. So I guess overall it's more on the spectrum towards random practice, but that's why they do it. You can see a lot of practices are implementing all of the things that we're learning. Yeah. But think about it, if you were doing the same 2 basic throws, the whole, no, 1 throw, the whole practice, you're going to get bored very quickly, right? Serial would be like learning bunching combos. Statement or question, Casey? I guess so. The question is, I don't know how the boxing thing is structured, but you see how with serial practice, see how the order in which you're varying is the same each time. So it's you have variability, but it's in the same order. Whereas with random, the order is different day by day. So for boxing, think about it. Is the combo different each time, or is it's probably a skill jab across it? I would take that movement as probably one aspect, so one of these, and then it's the serial part or the random part would be what else you're doing. So you do that for 5 minutes, and then what else are you doing after that practice? Part of the practice. Do you do something completely different, or is it always the same order of what you're doing? So consider jab hook cross as one skill that you're practicing, or one variation you're practicing. What's the next variation after you do that in practice? Is it always the same thing? Is it random? Okay, and then after that, so you do jab, then you do combo, then what's after that? And so every practice, are you going in that order? Okay, so that would be serial. But there's probably more you're learning. You're not just doing that as an MMA class, right? They're probably a random order of like the different aspects that you're learning per practice. Yeah. I put this video in. You can the links in the lecture slides. I would look it up because they're talking about, even for interest's sake, about the examples of motor control and learning research in real life practice situations, and sort of the basis behind a lot of it. Super interesting.
Motor learning is the study of how people acquire skill through practice. There's a massive gap, though, between what this science says and the way that we coach. Our mission at Train Ugly is to change that. So today we're going to be talking about block versus random practice and how to apply some scientifically proven principles to improve the effectiveness of practice. Let's do it. Hey, go, go, hey, go, go. So there are a few motor learning terms we need to understand as we work through this essay. First, practice performance. These are the short-term improvements you see during a particular drill or during a particular day of practice. Real learning refers to the improvements that we see the next day or during the actual game. Motor learning scientists use the terms retention and transfer to describe this real learning. This is simply describing the amount of improvements that we see during practice that show up the next day or show up during the game.
I think one of the most important things that the motor learning science has come up with isn't about how you look in practice, but it's how you perform later. And performance, which is always after practice by a day or a week or whatever, is best because you do things that have higher levels of retention. So that's a pretty key word. Does it promote better retention? Because it's not what they can do in practice, it's what they can do later on.
So as coaches, one of our main jobs should be to look at ways to maximize this retention and transfer. So the improvements we see during practice show up on game day when the lights are on and your grandma's in the stands. So we have a couple of things to do.
Oh, we're frozen. What happened? Pretty good. So let's look at a study that evaluated the differences in learning between blocked versus random practice. And so this study was done really early, so 1986, but they wanted to sort of use badminton serves as the motor skill they wanted to teach. So they were going to teach them badminton shots, and they were going to introduce variability by having them do short, long, and drive serves. So whatever that means, all from the right side of the court. The tension or retention test would be driving or serving from the opposite side, so from the left side of the court. What they did was they broke down the two groups into blocked and random practice. And what did it show? It showed that the group that did the random practice learn significantly better. And so sort of validated this idea of random practice leads to more improved learning, or high contextual interference leads to better learning. Question then, so Samantha, Casey, or whoever, why would block practice schedules lead to poorer learning? What are some of the ideas that you have? I think we've said all of them, I think. But. Yep. Yeah, boredom, right? They're not cognitively evaluating what they're doing. I don't think it would be pain per se, because they would still get pain in random practice. But by doing the same thing over and over again, they're going to get bored, but they're also going to probably get really good at that practice skill. And then they're going to misjudge how good they are. And if they think they're that good, they're going to stop focusing on what they're doing. So they misjudge the amount that they're learning, which also, in effect, other than boredom, would also cause them to pay less attention. Yeah, I get what you're saying, Samantha. But I think that with the repetitive movements of like the different sport, like I think random practice would be just as potentially causing repetitive pain. If you're already getting the job, watch her. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it, Casey. And that's the way we're wired, right? It's human nature. If you think you're really good at it, you're like, next, I got this, right? You're not really thinking. But if you're like, oh my God, I really want this job. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. It's going to force you to motivate you to like try even harder, right? Does that make sense? Awesome. So, like I said, there's limits to this idea of contextual interference, right? You want to consider the motor skill characteristics and the learner characteristics before just throwing high contextual interference at them. Ahmed has a question. Will that constant self-doubt cause performance issue? Yeah, probably. But if you want them to see progress and not feel like they're experts, right? You always want to be continually progressing. So if the learners aren't progressing, then we're dealing with where they're going to have low motivation. Yeah, so does overcome, exactly. There's always going to be a middle ground, right? There's always the middle ground. You want to be in that middle, always in the middle. So some skills show initially that high contextual interference is bad, right? So skills that are really, really difficult, or if we're dealing with really new beginners, high contextual interference may be too much. Yes, exactly. And so what's funny about Ahmed, what do you notice about really, really good athletes? They're always like, how did you do? Man, I could have done this better. Like, the really good ones are always never fully impressed, right? Is that what George Pierre did? Think about it. Like think of all. Oh, is that what it is? Whatever happened to GSP? He's on bet 3.5 or bet 9.5 or whatever. So the limits of the contextual interference effect are going to be based on whether or not you have a very difficult task or a very low-skilled learner. You may want to start with low contextual interference and then progress up to high contextual interference, just so that way you're not discouraging the learners. Does that make sense, everyone? It's called the challenge point hypothesis. And so researchers tried to come up with theories as to why high contextual interference leads to better learning. And we've talked about it all class about sort of engaging in this problem solving ability and disrupting memory representation. So the elaboration hypothesis suggested that by having variations of the skill, it leads to a better memory representation. Just like I tell you about academics, you want to look at the material, ask yourself questions, do cue cards, try to teach it, hit it from different angles, because it leads to a better understanding in long-term memory. The action plan reconstruction hypothesis suggests that by having variations and problem-solving ability, you're better applying what you've learned in a real-life situation. So both are true and both are what happened, but these are just two theories that before research started, why potentially high contextual interference would lead to better learning, and then they proved it. And so again, remember, higher levels of contextual interference lead to more attention in what you're doing during practice. And block schedules tend to bore people or have them overestimate how well they're doing, and then they stop giving attention. I added this slide a couple years ago, I believe, because in lecture 7, I talked about practice specificity, and you want practice to match the game situation in a sense. So does that mean that it's at odds with this concept of practice variability? And no, it's just two different concepts. So when we were talking about practice specificity, I was talking about how whatever sensory processes are available during practice, you want it to match the sensory processes that are available in the real life situation. Because remember that example of concurrent feedback, or the people with crutches that when they had the monitor telling them how much weight they were putting on their foot, it led them to become dependent on it. And so in the real life situation, they didn't perform as well because they became dependent on it and didn't learn. That's what practice specificity is talking about, the sensory processes. So when we're talking about practice variability, we're talking about the movement variations that they would see in real life. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, awesome. Any questions so far? Got shabby lips. Talking too much. It's part of the coffee version. Everyone's okay? Yeah. Awesome. So now let's talk about concepts behind the amount of practice that's required, right? So let's consider the amount of practice and the spacing between practices that would help maximize or hinder motor learning then. So the question is then, how much practice should people engage in? And if they've practiced up to a point where they've learned the motor skill, is more practice better? This may not always be the case. We're going to be talking about a concept called diminishing returns. It's super interesting. And so the things that researchers have considered are the amount of time to practice, the length of each sessions, and some factors in the rest between sessions. So this first concept is this idea of overlearning. So can overlearning lead to better skill retention? And so in research and as a term, the term overlearning means continuing practice past a point where they've already learned a skill to a particular criterion. And so usually here we go. Okay, so for your, usually you want to confirm that you have to hit this percentage in school to prove that you've learned the material, right? So what, pass, fail, right? So if you get over 50, you've passed the course, you've learned the material enough. Is there a benefit to learning the course past that to ensure that you would retain that information? As an example of overlearning. So typically when we're learning specific skills, there's like the optimal level to prove that we've learned it up to a certain point. This study came from the US Army, and this concept of overlearning came from this idea or this factor or this sort of like situation where at the time, I think this was done in the 80s. So in basic training, the US Army would figured out that, okay, so if we practiced, gun cleaning, like, you know, in the movies where they take apart the gun, clean it, and put it back together blindfolded. So in basic, in Army training, you're taught how to take apart your gun and clean it and put it back together. Super important, right? And so they figured out, okay, so on average, we need to teach them for hypothetical number 10 hours, right, over 10 days to make sure that they all have a proficiency level at the end of basic training to know that skill. What they found was that, so they would finish basic training, they would be really good at, you know, up to the performance level they needed to be able to take apart the gun, clean it, and put it back together. They'd go away, go back home, and then when they got called back to the Army base to go to war or whatever, call to duty, they lost that skill. So even though that they had learned it up to the point that was required in the training, they weren't retaining that information when they had to come back months later. So they developed this idea of overlearning. So what the US Army said was, okay, so if it took 10 hours for them to learn it, what if we added 100% more training time? Would it mean that they would retain that information better? And that's what they did. So they developed this idea of 100% overlearning, 100% more trials, and it led to better retention when they got called back to the base. Does that make sense, everyone? So that's where the concept of overlearning came from. Training past or practice past the point of them reaching a performance level required for better retention. It shows the best benefit for procedural skills. Keep hitting the thing. Sorry, guys. Is everyone okay? Does everyone get that? Because the US Army, or in that study, they did 100% overlearning. So 100% more practice. This study, which was done much more recently, and here's the picture of it. So this was a stabilimeter, they called it, or dynamic balance scale. So they had to balance their weight evenly to be able to stand on this platform. It was like a teeter-totter, okay? And so what they found was that they had to get up to a point of amount of practice where they got up to a performance level. They could hold it for 10 seconds or something, right? Then they had different groups where they would give them different overlearning strategies of 50%, 100%, and 200%. What they found was that 50% overlearning was just as good as 100% or 200%. So then why do 100, right? The other thing that they found was that the group, there was a point called diminishing returns where more learning would lead to poorer performance on a retention test. So when they got up to 100 and 200%, the groups that did that amount of practice actually did worse than the 50% overlearning. Why would that be? Any ideas? Yeah. Yeah, they got bored, exactly. But when they're bored, they can start developing, they stop caring, they're getting bored, they're not thinking about it, then you develop oh my God, what am I thinking about? Bad habits, yeah. They're not thinking about it. They start developing bad habits and then becomes ingrained, and then they're actually worse. So that was really interesting that, like, how many of you have overstudied? typically when you say I overstudied for that test, you went through the process and you were overstudying, you were doing the same thing over and over again. And then so you got your way of thinking, like understanding the material academically, and then you just stopped challenging yourself. So when you went to the test, you were like, oh my God, this is not exactly on the 1,000 times I studied it, it's not worded that same way. Now I don't know how to problem solve this question. I'm gonna freak out. Over learning. It's okay, that's all of us. But now we understand the overlearning, right? That it can develop bad habits. You're not challenging yourself, and so it becomes ingrained. You lose the ability, the problem solving ability. And that's what it is about learning that helps us retain that information. For sporting motor skills, they found that you, instead of like practicing aspects of the skill, you could do maybe more practice than 50%, but have the students or the learners determine what they wanted in practice, right? Keep it fun because they're choosing what to practice. Okay, so I need to stop overlearning and start aiming for 50s. Gotcha. No, what you should do, okay, so like, hey, true say, you should practice studying a certain amount and maximizing your studying so that way you get the amount, like, I don't know, like pick a hypothetical number, right? Like, I didn't do well in this midterm. It's not that you should have studied more, you should have studied better. Challenge yourself. That makes sense, right? Awesome. So, like I said, there is a limit to this overlearning strategy as it can develop bad habits. And here was a study that looked specifically at that. And so in this study, they were doing, those pursuit tasks where you had to use a stylus and move it. And so it's a weird hypothetical motor skill. And then it had 5 groups. And they also showed this idea of diminishing returns. So here was the 50% overlearning. That was 0% overlearning, 100, blah, blah. So Ahmed asked, but where do you find the patience and motivation to constantly challenge yourself? Because, and how many times have you heard this? You want to be a student of the game. You need to be motivated to really want to succeed in what you do. If you really love what you do, then the motivation is easy. Thank you. Thank you. So does everyone get this idea of overlearning and the concept of diminishing returns that can happen after 50% overlearning, which is typically true of simple tasks and closed skills? Everyone gets it? Awesome. Okay. And so again, here we have the reasons why overlearning can lead to poor performance. You're not engaging in cognitive effort, and then you can develop bad habits. And you're losing that problem-solving ability. Okay, so now let's talk about how you want to distribute your practices. And so basically the concept of how to distribute your practices is whether or not you want to work with massed versus distributed practices. So what's the best way to schedule the available time, right? So if you have 10 hours to practice, is it better to do it in one 10-hour block or 10 one-hour blocks? You want to consider in terms of practice, distributing practice in terms of the length and frequency of each session, and then also the rest intervals between trials. So let's first talk about the length and frequency of practice sessions. Now, there's no set rules because a lot of the time when we're practicing, it's going to be based on the available time that we have. So typically with all the sporting or even rehab stuff, there is, 1 or 2 hours available per week. So how do you want to structure that, right? So you want to think about, this is what you have available. How do you want to structure that practice? But what if you had the option? So remember, you can do like weekend crash courses for like CPR or for even courses. Is it better to learn something with longer and fewer sessions or massed practice? Or is it better to have distributed practice where you have shorter and a greater number of sessions? Lowest effective time, yes. And that's what research shows. And why do you think that would be, Casey? And the one thing to mention is that in studies, they just compared massed versus distributed practice. It's very specific on the scale. So you can't say that like massed is anything that's over an hour, or there's no numbers. It's just massed is when you have longer and fewer sessions versus distributed practice is when you have shorter sessions, but greater frequency. And that's absolutely true, Jacob. The reason why distributed practice is better is it because it's good for consolidating rehearsal. For mass practices, you probably get bored and stop paying attention. Right? Just like Casey's saying. So in this study, this was the stabilimeter, the dynamic balance task, like the board where they had to practice balancing on it, the one that showed the diminished returns. What they wanted to do was look at massed versus distributed practice. And so they probably had the same amount of time, but they compared 1 day versus 2 day acquisition. So let's say it was hypothetically 1 hour. You did one session for 1 hour, or you did 30 minutes over 2 days, which led to better learning. Distributed practice. Yes, that's true on it. Here we have, this was golf putting. And so they all had to practice 240 trials and then see the two groups. One group did 4 days of 60 trials or practice sessions. 4 days of 60 practice trials for a total of 240, or mass practice, which was 1 day of 240 trials. Which group do you think did the best? The distributed one. On a 1 day and 7 day retention. The group that did the distributed practice learned better. So here are the reasons why, and we've all sort of discussed about them. Can you think of anything else? Why are distributed practice sessions more effective than massed? We talked about this idea of fatigue. And so as you're doing it for a massed amount of time, you stop paying attention, you're bored. You're not cognitively paying attention to what you're doing. Therefore, you're not learning as much, right? It will lead to less cognitive effort. And by having more frequency, you're rehearsing, or you're getting memory out, right? You're taking long-term memory and applying and rehearsing it and putting it out and acting on it. Does that make sense, everyone? Any questions about mass versus distributed practice? Awesome. Okay. So now let's talk about the one last thing is how long should you wait in between practice trials? Okay, does that make sense? This one, research hasn't really come up to a sort of rule or generalized rule about it. The amount of time that you want to wait in between practice sessions is also going to be based on how tired the person is, if like they're mentally drained. There's different factors that are involved in considering how long to wait in between repetitions of trials within one practice. But generally speaking, when you do discrete skills, so think of like give me a discrete skill, darts. because they're very quick, you can wait a less amount of time in between trials. Whereas with continuous skills, because they're generally longer, you wait longer in between practice trials. You give the person maybe a chance to consolidate, to catch their breath. Does that make sense? So generally speaking, there is no set rules, but for continuous skills, because they generally take longer, you can wait a longer amount of time in between trials. Remember, this is just one practice session. Whereas small, shorter but discrete motor skills, you should wait or can wait a smaller amount of time between trials. Did that confuse anyone, or does it all make sense? Like if you're gonna do like Casey, if you're gonna do like jab, was it jab punch cross? No, jab cross punch. Right? How long does that take? Yeah. So then, are you gonna wait 10 minutes and then practice it again? No, it's quick. So you can wait a short amount of time in between trials. But now let's talk about something more continuous, something longer. Give me a. Okay, sparring, right? That's an aspect. So it's like 10-minute fight. Are you gonna stop and then do it right again? You're gonna give him time, right? You tell me, Michaela. Give me your sport or something that you're interested in. Or well, first you tell me what's the difference between a continuous and discrete motor skill. Okay. What sports do you like? A continuous skill, oh, there you go, okay. So a continuous skill is no discrete beginning and end, whereas a continuous skill has no discrete beginning and end, whereas a discrete skill has a discrete beginning and end. So for dance, if you're teaching one aspect of the dance routine, you could, give me like an example, I don't know, arabesque or something, whatever you're practicing, right? If it's like one very specific thing that takes a quick amount of time, there's the discrete beginning and end, you could have practice trials very close together. What happens if you're doing a whole dance routine? How long is a dance routine? 3, 4, 5 minutes? Would you have them stop and then do it right again? Or would you, because it's longer, have them sort of rest for a little bit and then go into it? Does that make sense, right? With this one, there's no set rule because for a dance routine, there is a discrete beginning and end there. It's just a longer. So for more continuous motor skills, you can wait longer. Whereas for discrete skills or more discrete skills, you should wait less time in between trials. And that's the lecture. But hopefully you all find that you can apply all of this stuff into, well, academics, into coaching, training, dealing with your patients. Any questions about the material, everyone? Awesome. Okay, so next week is the last class. Any questions before we go? Woo woo. It'll be soon time for you all to move into the world and teach others as I have taught you. Keep it fun. I was just leaving. No one will say bye. I'm probably more like Yoda because based on size, but it's okay. I'll take it. Okay, bye everyone. Oh, the Simon says it's due the 12th. It's actually the 14th. Yeah, last day of classes. I'll change it. Okay, bye everyone. I'm meeting with someone right now, so I forget who, but I will send you a link.